I'm Nick Knutson, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler. Back this week after a short week off there. Will, appreciate you covering solo last week.
Yeah, man. I figured it needed to make the podcast better looking this week, so bring you back and get two people going back and forth. It was fun to go back and forth. A little bit of a shorter episode last week, but I'm sure we'll make up for it this week.
Oh, yeah. On this week's episode, we'll cover Walter Nolen, Nick Evers updates. We got returning production rankings from across college football, where the big plays are going to come from in 2021, an article you wrote this week on rereaction.com. And England falls short. Little nod to the Euro finals on Sunday. I'm not a big soccer guy either. Just be patient. Stick around if you're not a soccer. We'll tie it back in an interesting way here to college football. But let's start off with two bits. All right, Nick Evers has made some noise this past week. Quarterback commit. Gator Dave, good interview with Nick and Monica Evers, his mother, on Gators Breakdown this past week. Be sure to check that out if you haven't, on Gators Breakdown. That was a good interview. Just listened to that a couple days ago here. But Nick Evers made some noise out at the Elite 11 camp in California, finishing third in a contest that's really loaded, Will. I mean, including two other fellow Texas-based quarterbacks that have had a bigger profile on the recruiting trail, and that's quarterbacks Ohio State commit Quinn Ewers and the Elite 11 MVP and Clemson commit Cade Klubnik. Bigger names than Evers, but Evers seemed to impress and made a lot of noise out there. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, Evers has been making his way up the charts. I think as he's gotten more and more time to sort of go and show what he can do. COVID sort of maybe thrown some of the rankings a little bit off this year, just because guys haven't been able to get to camps, show what they can do, those sorts of things. So like you mentioned, finished third out of 20 participants. He's the 281st overall recruit according to 24/7 Composite. That's probably going to go up. And if you look at his high school stats, so 67.6% of his passes completed his junior season. That indicates he's throwing to the right guy. At the same time, he's only averaged 8.7 yards per attempt on those throws, which does say he's checking down a lot. So I think there is hope based on the way he's throwing the ball down the field, and certainly the way he showed out in the camp. At the same time, I think, I'm not ready to put the Joe Burrow comparisons in for Nick Evers yet, because the numbers that he put up his junior year in high school look remarkably like what Luke Del Rio did his senior year in high school. So he still needs to make that jump to where he's got that high completion percentage and he's getting the ball down the field. But certainly a very promising offseason development to see Evers really show out at the Elite 11 camp.
Well, one of the things he did mention is he wasn't really on in that interview with on Gators Breakdown, was he wasn't really on a lot of radars before this past season here, and it kind of took off during the season. But you have to think, I remember when he committed, I believe he was a 3-star commit. Am I correct on that?
Yep.
Is it a 3-star commit, and now he's up to a 4-star? How much of that notoriety though comes from the fact that, hey, Dan Mullen's putting his stamp on this guy, obviously recruited him heavily enough to where the kid's committed already? How much does that help his profile in recruiting?
I mean, I think you see that with the recruiting services, that if a guy's got offers from Alabama and Florida and Ohio State and Clemson, then he's going to be rated relatively high, because the people who do the evaluations for these recruiting services trust the guys who do the evaluations for these blue blood programs. So there is a little bit of a feedback loop there where, guys can artificially go higher or lower. I think the big thing is that my biggest complaint with the recruiting profiles is I'm not sure that they do a real good job of sussing out the important things for quarterbacks. When they're looking at, say, a defensive tackle or an offensive lineman, they're kind of projecting and saying this guy's an NFL level talent. And that's how they set the 5-star or the 4-star, or the 3-star. And I think that makes sense for a guy who's a running back or an offensive lineman or something like that, where the physical skill is a huge part of what they do. But when you go to quarterback, where reading defenses is really, really important, I think you can get a quarterback who's really a high level college performer who maybe doesn't have all the tools to be an NFL quarterback. I mean, guys like Tebow, guys like Wirfel sort of jump to mind, where those guys were great in their own ways, but were not necessarily high-profile NFL prospects. I mean, Tebow obviously went in the first round, but at the same time, the way he performed when he got to the NFL, I think, sort of indicates that maybe that was a little bit of a mistake. So I think that's one of the things, is that Guys who don't have huge arms tend to be lower to start with. And then again, like I mentioned, COVID has been a weird time. And so guys who are good probably haven't gotten as big a look. So guys who were good in their freshman and sophomore years, got a lot of playing time, got a lot of visibility, are going to naturally rank higher just because those are people who've already been seen. Evers, like you said, coming on the scene a little bit late, I'm sure that he's going to be able to rise or fall based on how he plays in his senior year.
Well, certainly strong performance out at the Elite 11, showing that he's really earning that ranking, not just the tie to Florida there. But another piece of news in the recruiting landscape, Florida makes the top 5 for 5-star defensive lineman Walter Nolen. Updated his top schools this past week to include Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, and Michigan. And if you're surprised by Josh Heupel's first year, the Tennessee Volunteers hasn't, a lot of negative news out there with Tennessee this past offseason. If you're surprised by their inclusion, I'm just going to remind you, he's from Cordova, Tennessee, which is just outside of Memphis. So he is a Tennessee guy. But I did like this past week, you're seeing guys like Gervon Dexter. I mean, Evers is very vocal on Twitter toward other recruits as well. But Gervon Dexter's out there saying on Twitter this week, I played at every SEC game as a freshman. Everything the coaches told me that was going to happen has happened. He tags Walter Nolen in that. You like to see that from the guys on the roster.
Well, yeah, especially since he's going to be competing with Nolen for playing time if he comes to Florida, right? But yeah, I mean, you love to see that the recruits who are coming in buy into the staff, buy into the program, especially when you've got a guy who's a high-level prospect like Gervon Dexter, obviously the 12th ranked overall recruit last year, and now you've got Nolen, the 2nd ranked overall recruit. You put those guys side by side next year on the defensive line at Florida, and all of a sudden you're talking about real high-level talent at that defensive tackle position, and obviously Nolen is going to be a true freshman. You don't want to put too much on a true freshman. At the same time, that 5-star is supposed to mean that you're able to step in, that you're able to make an impact, that you're able to really sort of be a man among the boys. Then if you're if you come into the SEC, and so yeah, it's a big deal if Florida's able to get him, especially with the talent they already have there at defensive tackle.
Would landing such a high-profile recruit change the conversation around Mullen and recruiting a little bit, or we're not quite there? One guy's not going to do it.
No, I mean, because if you were gonna say that, I think you'd say the same thing about Dexter, right? I mean, Dexter was really the first composite 5-star that they had landed out of high school last year. And Dexter was a little bit different because when he committed, he was a high 4-star. He wasn't a 5-star. He got the 5-star after he'd committed to Florida, so maybe it's a little bit different in that respect. But at the end of the day, like you look at a team like Ohio State, they've got like 7 guys who are 5-star. They got 4 5-stars right now. LSU's got 3. Florida State has 2. Alabama has 3. So you look at USC has 2. So you look at the big boys out there who are recruiting at a high level in college football, and they're all bringing in multiple 5-star candidates. And that to me is when it starts to change the perception. Is if you get 3 or 4 5-star level guys who come into your program in one particular year, well, then you've really stocked the cabinet, and you do that a couple of years in a row, and you're even able to miss on a couple of them, and you're still going to have high level performers on both sides of the ball if you can do it that way.
All right. I was just trying to help Coach Mullen out there, man. All right. Let's move on to 4 bits. We saw a tweet from Bill Conley this week talking about returning production. And he cited that the typical national average of returning production in college football is around 62.6% of return. Like that's a higher number than I would have expected for an average. But the 2021 average is 76.7%, and only 14 teams fall below the typical national average this year because of how many people are returning with COVID, with the transfer portal opening, everything going on there. I'm going to throw the chart up here in a second here, but just for our reference, I'm looking at 1 through 116 here. I'm noticing that Clemson only has 68%. They're ranked 104th in returning production. Georgia's at 65% at 110. Will, you got the extended list here. I don't see Florida, Alabama, or Ohio State on my list right now, but we'll put the extended list up for everybody on the show.
Yeah, Florida's at 57%, the 121st ranked team. Alabama, 56%, the 123rd ranked team. Notre Dame, 55%, 124th ranked team. Ohio State, 51%, 125th ranked team out of 127. So, this is one of the ways that Phil Steele in particular seems to really like to rank teams is based on the amount of returning production they have from the standpoint of, you look at the level of talent that they have, but then you also look at how much of that talent has experience that's coming back. That he's been pretty accurate in terms of the way that he's picked teams performing. You look at a team like Georgia, no, they don't have a ton returning, but it's more than what Florida has returning. I think you're probably less concerned with teams like Alabama just because they've sort of proven that they can turn things over. And but again, it's at quarterback where it can be really, really critical that they don't have any experience and they're going to be coming to the swamp week 3 without any experience. The other thing that I do think is interesting when you start looking at that is that a lot of the talent that Florida lost on the offensive side of the ball is obviously crucial, right? I mean, you got Pitts, Tony, Grimes, Trask all leaving. But on the defensive side of the ball, the guys that they're losing are kind of the guys who you can afford to lose, right? Guys like Donovan Steiner, guys like Sean Davis, guys like Marco Wilson. Those are guys who were out there but weren't necessarily difference makers. And in fact, in many cases, were actually maybe a net negative last year. And so now you've got younger guys stepping in. Now, obviously, you've got the mistakes of youth, but I'm not sure that they're going to be a whole lot worse than they were last year. Maybe just as bad, but they won't be worse. And so, I think most of the time when you lose that experience, the expectation is that things are going to be much, much worse because you've lost that experience. At least on the defensive side of the ball, I'm not sure that Florida really has to look forward to that all that much, just because, not because the guys are going to be so much better, but because I'm not sure they can be worse.
I think it's a lot of what Florida is just the unknown. And I think you mentioned Phil Steele because I've been seeing reports that he does not have Florida ranked in his preseason top 25. That's a little shocking to me. But a lot of that comes from the fact that I think people just don't fully understand what this roster is just yet. You see a lot of, like, when you just Google Florida football, a lot of it is just questions about what they're going to look like this year. And if you don't follow this roster closely and understand how Dan Mullen has run things down here, I could see why, from a national perspective, there would be a lot of questions around this roster. And when you lose that type of talent to the NFL, I mean, most rosters, you lose a guy like Kyle Pitts, that's setting you back quite a bit. Not that it's not going to set Florida back, but I do believe that Mullen has shown what was the talk around the wide receivers last offseason? That how are they going to replace that level of production? Guys like Vance Jefferson getting out of town, that's going to be tough to replace. I think they did a good job. I think they did a good job last year. Just because we don't know the guys, like the way, as well as the national scene, or the national scene doesn't know these guys that well yet, doesn't mean it isn't going to happen. So I don't take this chart too seriously, especially in the COVID year, Will.
I mean, I take it pretty seriously only because, and we'll get to this in a minute, but the level of explosiveness for Tony, Pitts, and Grimes, even when they were playing second fiddle to guys like Swain and Hammond and Cleveland and Jefferson, the level of explosiveness, the way they were able to catch balls when they were targeted was still at a very high level. So you looked at it and said, if they can maintain those ratios while just having the number of targets go up, we're going to be reasonably successful. Now, I don't think anybody saw what was coming last year, right? I mean, you got a guy step up and almost win the Heisman Trophy at quarterback, and then you've got Pitts becoming the highest rated tight end in the NFL draft, basically ever. Mm-hmm. And then you got Tony going in the first round. If you'd have told me before the season that Trask was going to be drafted below Pitts and Tony, but they'd all be gone by the middle of the second round, I'd be like, all right, Florida just had a really good year. So again, I think that things are different, right? I mean, Tony, Pitts, and Grimes all had experience last year, and they would have contributed significantly to the amount of production that Florida had coming back. And I think when you look at the fact that they really, for all intents and purposes, Emory Jones has almost no experience at the quarterback position, throwing the ball, running the ball a little bit. You look at the tight ends, there's not a ton of experience there. I mean, you've got Gamble, but then Zipper is the next person up there. Running back, if you got Malik Davis and Damian Pierce and Naquan Wright coming back, so obviously there's a little bit of experience there. But and then nothing at defensive back. I mean, right, all the defensive backs and everybody except Kyrie Elam are people who don't have a whole lot of experience. It's one thing to say, hey, we're going to replace a quarterback everybody else is experienced. Or it's one thing to say, hey, we're going to bring back a guy who lit it up last year at quarterback and we're going to replace all of his weapons. It's a very different thing to say, we're replacing it all and we'll see what'll happen. And Dan Mullen had some down years at Mississippi State. I mean, when Nick Fitzgerald took over for Dak Prescott, the offense took a step back. I just don't think the offense didn't take a major step back. It's not like they went from scoring 35 points a game to scoring 21 points a game. It wasn't McElwainian or anything over there. It was they went from scoring 35 points to 31 points, right? And so I suspect that's probably what Florida's going to see is a little bit of a pullback on offense, a little bit of a improvement on defense, just again, because I'm not sure it can get much worse. And then when you factor those things together, along with the fact that they went 0-3 in one-score games last year, and so that's going to start to even itself out. So maybe they go 2-1, 3-0 in one-score games this year. They pull out those close games, and if they do that, then the season will look more successful, even if the offense is a little bit worse and the defense isn't necessarily all that much better.
The reason, though, I don't take this chart too serious is you have to go this, and this includes the group of 5 schools. So that's why, I mean, such a deep chart includes group of 5 and power 5. You have to go to the 80th school on the list, which is LSU, to get under 75% returning production. So while that can also point to the fact that, well, that means your schedule is going to be tougher across the board because more teams are going to have more returners. It just feels like so much of college football is benefiting from having extra players return that they normally wouldn't have. That I don't know if it's a distinct advantage for any team, one team over the other is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think
it's flooded. Everyone has that advantage to a point.
So, except for Florida.
Yeah, but even Florida, you look at it, who would have been gone this year on the roster that came back? I mean, even like I know everyone's not necessarily thrilled with like the play of Stuart Reese or Delance or everything, but it does help having that experience back on the line, right? This year, it doesn't hurt.
Sure. I mean, it would have been stupid for them to stay, but Tony and Grimes could have stayed, right? I mean, there are guys who could have stayed because they all had an extra year of eligibility, but because of the success that they had last year,
right,
all those guys left. And to be honest, I think because of the negativity as well on the defensive side of the ball, a lot of those guys left as well, right? And I mean, I'm sure that there were guys who just said, you know what, I don't need this. I'm going to go test the waters. You get a guy like Marco who's able to put up unbelievable combine numbers to the point where he ends up getting drafted, even though I'm not sure his play necessarily indicates that should be the case. So, look, I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. This is actually the ramifications of all the transfers, that the transfers pushed back the playing time for some of the recruits. And last year we saw it. We were sitting that usually programs take a step back in year 3, and Florida didn't take a step back. Florida took a step forward, at least on the offensive side of the ball. And one of the reasons they were able to take that step forward is because they've been bolstering their roster with these transfers who've come in. It gave a little bit of time for some of these other guys. Van Jefferson allowed Kadarius Toney to develop into a key weapon last year because Jefferson was carrying the load while Toney was learning. And so everything sort of hit all at once last year. But the problem is you're going to have that down year from that transition recruiting cycle. And you look at that 2018 class that Florida brought in, guys like John Huggins and just all sorts of guys who either have left because they were really good, like Kyle Pitts, or they haven't really developed into the players we want them to be, or there's even been attrition and they left the program. And that typically happens in a transition class, which is why that third year takes a step back. And I think every program is going to experience a down year. The question is, how down of the year is it? Are you able to stave it off? And, the interesting thing is, like I said, 0-3 in one-score games last year. So it actually kind of feels like a down year because you end up 8-4. But, the year before they went 3-1. The year before that, they went 3-0 in one-score games. If they have a season like that, you're sitting there at, 11-1, 10-2, talking about how successful of a year it is, even if the underlying stats and even if just the general feel is that the team isn't quite as good.
Yeah, I think it's something that you do make a lot of good points there, but I just want to stress that something like this, I don't worry about it because it just feels like an observation about the sport as a whole. And I know Florida's on the downside of that chart, and I get it, but like I think that there's a lot of good players stepping into these different roles, and it's just going to look different this year. So I don't worry too much. Bama and Ohio State aren't too high on that list for a reason too. They're putting guys in the NFL, and I'm not putting Florida in that class. I'm not saying that just yet, but I do think that because of the success on the field, that's why you're seeing those numbers, obviously.
Put it this way: on the offensive side of the ball, I have far fewer worries than having a defensive coordinator who struggled to get juniors and seniors to line up, now in charge of a bunch of guys without a bunch of experience.
Say his name. It's not an episode if you don't say his name.
Voldemort, man. I'm not allowed to say.
All right, man. Let's move on to 6 bits. Will, you wrote an interesting article this week. Where will the big plays come from in 2021? Not too different than the topic we were just talking about here, but let me ask you something. Where do you start? Where's your mind start on this process? Like, how did you start developing this article, and how do you arrive at your conclusion on it?
Well, so it starts where it starts every year. So Doug Nussmeier in 2017 wrote
Said
about
his name.
Yeah, well, sorry. So he wrote about, or there were a bunch of articles that came out where he was talking about red zone offense being important. And so I started thinking, well, is that actually true? And it turns out it's not. Red zone offense doesn't correlate whether you're looking at number of times you're in the red zone, whether you're looking at red zone conversion rates or all that sort of stuff. It doesn't correlate with scoring in a real linear fashion. There's a little bit of a correlation, but it's pretty weak. But if you look at yards per play, the correlation is really strong. And so what that indicates is that teams that hit big plays are much more apt to score more points than teams that just sort of putter their way down the field and then convert in the red zone. And so what that means is you got to start looking at explosive plays, right? You got to say, okay, 20 plus yard plays in the pass game, 10 plus yard plays in the run game. Who gets the most of those? And so can we use that to predict whether a receiver is going to be able to put up explosive plays? And it turns out that at least over the last couple of years, you've been able to. So Freddie Swain in 2018 didn't have a whole lot of targets, but he had a lot of explosives per target. Kadarius Toney back in 2019 didn't have a lot of targets because he got injured, but he had a bunch of explosives per target. I think he had 3 explosives and 13 targets. And then you look at the 2020 team, and the guy who really jumped out at me that was a little bit strange, at least for me, was Trent Whittemore. Had 3 explosives and 12 targets, 10 catches out of the 12 targets. So that says 2 things. 1, it says he's getting open, and 2, it says he's getting open downfield. Now, there was one play, I think it was against Ole Miss, where it was a downfield throw to Whittemore. It wasn't Ole Miss. It was later. Maybe it was A&M. But there was a downfield throw that looked sort of like a bad throw by Trask that Whittemore went up and high pointed and brought down. And you sort of look at it and go, that's interesting. But overall, Whittemore was able to turn a limited number of targets into explosive plays. You start looking at a guy like Xavier Henderson. He had 18 targets. He only had 8 catches, only had 1 explosive. So the question is, does that start to translate? Does that say something about his route running, about his ability to get open, about his ability to get separation? I think it does in some respects. And Jacob Copeland's sort of in the middle. So he was right around 50% of the catches, or 50% of his targets he was getting catches on, a little bit more than that, like 56%, I think, last year. But he did have a bunch of explosives. So if he can improve how often he's getting open and how often he's able to catch the ball when he's targeted, then he's going to be able to bring explosive plays to the fore. But the big thing is if you look last year, so Tony Pitts and Grimes, 211 targets, 151 catches, 42 explosives. Everyone else, 250 targets, 168 catches, 33 explosives. So what that means is that on an explosive per target basis, Tony Pitts and Grimes, every time they caught the ball, 20% of the time it turned into a 20-plus yard play. Everyone else, only 13% of the time did it turn into a 20-plus yard play. And if you had looked at the wide receivers in 2019 and said, all right, well, let's look at Tony Pitts and Grimes, you would have said, it's about an 18% explosive rate for the 4 receivers who left. It's an 18% explosive rate for Tony Pitts and Grimes. Hey, I think we'll be okay. In fact, I wrote an article last year that sort of said the same thing. This year, I'm saying I think the wide receiver is going to take a step back. So when people get mad at me, when I talk about potentially Malik Davis going into the slot or trying to have 2-back sets or trying to find extra points or yardage in the punt return game and the kick return game, one of the reasons is that I don't think that they're going to be quite as explosive through the air. But again, they should be a whole lot more explosive on the ground with Emory Jones running the ball. And the question is just going to be, does that offset the lack of explosiveness through the air? Or do you get a guy like Whittemore or a guy like Copeland who steps up, or is 18 targets just not a real good sample size for Henderson, and all of a sudden he jumps up? The one that really jumps out is Kamari Gamble, had something like 10 catches on 26 targets and only a couple of explosive plays. And Zipper was much more like Whittemore in terms of catches per target and also explosives. And so that's one of the moves I think you'll want to see as the season moves on, is Keon Zipper getting more time at tight end.
One name I did not hear in there was Justin Shorter, which I don't think he really lived up to expectations of. I mean, people like I was pretty excited when he transferred down here from Penn State, but I mean, he certainly got the frame. You look at him; he looks massive on the field, and he looks like he's got the speed and everything. What should we expect from Justin Shorter this year?
Yeah, so I mean, Shorter had 25 catches on 39 targets, so 64% of the time he was targeted. He caught the ball, but that was on a lot of bubble screens, and he only 5% of his catches went for explosive plays.
Mm.
That's problematic. I mean, that's not a highly explosive guy. And you think about a 5-star recruit, that's sort of what you expect is explosion. That's not necessarily what we saw from Shorter. Now, I do think that maybe is selling things short a little bit because he did drop a few balls down the field that would have been explosive plays. So let's say he catches 2 downfield throws. Now he's 27 of 39, but now that percentage is up in the 12 or 13% range. And we go, okay, he's going to at least be as good as everybody else on the roster when it comes to generating explosives. But woulda, coulda, shoulda, right? I mean, the ball hits you in the hands
right
on a downfield throw. You got to get to it, and Shorter has not shown that yet. Emory Jones, even in the Oklahoma game, I think hit Shorter right in the hands, maybe even twice, and the ball just wasn't brought in. That's going to have to change because Jones throws a nice deep pass. I think there's some questions about his overall, and not for any reason other than we haven't seen it, but I think there are some questions about his overall ability to go through progressions, hit guys sort of deep over the middle, but hitting guys deep down the sidelines, that's something he's been showing since his freshman year in 2018 when he was chucking the ball against Georgia. I think got a pass interference call on a play he came in when they had a series for him against the Bulldogs.
So Whittemore, Zipper in the passing game you're looking for. How do you
and Rick Wells?
And Rick Wells?
Rick Wells, 11 catches on 16 targets. The guy's getting open.
How do you project guys like that didn't get a lot of playing time like Lingard or transfer like Bowman? How do you project that based on like limited statistics then?
I mean, I don't know that you can project it. I think you sort of look at, you look at explosiveness. I mean, Lingard obviously had an explosive profile before the knee injury, looked pretty good in his like 2 carries against Vanderbilt last year, but it's kind of hard to gauge that much out of that. I think what you sort of do is say, okay, let's call those guys icing on top, right? Like DeMarcus Bowman is a redshirt freshman who hasn't seen much playing time at all. Okay, that's probably like, I'm not sure he's going to be in early in the season anyway, because who knows whether he's got the pass protection schemes down. You hope he does, but that's going to be the limiting factor. Is a guy like Malik Davis or a guy like Damian Pierce is going to make sure that Emory Jones doesn't get blindsided. And that's probably more important than having a guy who can take the ball to the house. Just because if the guy takes it to the house, that's great. But if he offsets it by getting his quarterback hit in the back, that's not necessarily something you're going to be able to live with. So I don't know that you can project the explosiveness from those guys. I think you sort of look at their profiles and say they'd be great additions. But I think you sort of look at the roster in terms of what we already have and say, okay, if we add to that, like let's say Bowman averages a yard more a carry than Pierce and Wright and Davis did last year, what does that mean for the offense? It probably means 2, 3, 4 more explosive plays. I don't think it means a complete overhaul of the offense. And that's sort of the point, is that one of the reasons that Florida's offense was so good 2 years ago and was so good last year is because it wasn't just Kyle Pitts and you just zeroed in on Kyle Pitts and that was it. In fact, I would say that's probably one of the things that sort of hurt him against Texas A&M was that it was the Tony and Pitts show, and that was it, right? There wasn't anybody else who really stepped up in that game. One of the things that really helped against Georgia is while everybody was paying attention to Tony and Pitts, all of a sudden the wheel routes started going crazy and they were able to hit tight ends. They were able to hit running backs against linebackers. So that'll be the thing is having a guy like Whittemore or having a guy like Zipper who can get open consistently, hopefully opens things up for the other guys.
I mean, this level of detailed analysis it's why I love your work, Will, but it's also why I could see Phil Steele going like, I don't know, just leave him out. Just leave him out of the top 25. I'm not sure this year. Like you can totally see it, right? He's just frustrated. He's thinking about it too much. He's just like, whatever. They're playing Alabama week 3. He's probably just writing this off. So hopefully Phil Steele's wrong on that. He's usually semi-accurate. That's the problem with that, but hopefully he's off. So we'll look forward to those explosive plays. Be sure to check out Will's article on readandreaction.com. It's a good piece. Let's move on to $1. And Will, on Sunday, Italy hosted England in the Euro finals in London. I know I'm not a big soccer guy. You're not a big soccer guy. We've talked about this, but I have a group of friends that they are just as into international soccer as they are college football. They follow both very closely. So I've gone from knowing absolutely nothing about it to knowing very little, but at least having a good group of people to ask my dumb questions to, basically. So for those of you who are about as soccer illiterate as I am, the run the English team made to the Euro Cup finals over the last month, it's been pretty historic here. England has never won a Euro. They've not played in the final of a major tournament since they last won the World Cup in 1966. But they're always the team you always hear about, and they always have the big superstar. So I'm trying to understand the English football team better. I asked this group of friends, I asked them, give me the college football equivalent to England. They always have some level of hype, a talented roster with a superstar usually leading the way, and yet they consistently fail to deliver the result expected. My buddy replied back in 10 seconds, they're 100% Georgia. Which, if anyone watched the game on Sunday, England lost in devastating fashion, as only the English can, in penalty kicks. They lost 3-2. They really just absolutely choked in the penalty kicks, and Italy ends up getting the win. So, Will, with that omen for Georgia heading into the 2021 season, I know at some point we're probably the talent's just there. They've got to get lucky one of these years to make that run. We saw them make a run to the finals, the championship game against Alabama in 2017, end up losing in devastating fashion, second 26 to Tua. But at some point, Georgia probably will break through. I hate saying it, they probably will. But if they do, are we going to see any type of run like where I used the comparison with you? We were talking about this the other day. Ohio State took about 40 years to win a national championship when they finally won one in 2002. Michigan took forever. They won one a split title in 1997. But Michigan did not capitalize on that national title, whereas Ohio State completely transformed their program. If Georgia finally breaks through and wins the national title one of these years, unlike the English football team did on Sunday here, what do you expect Georgia to become? Like, when we could stop saying the 1980 thing, they get the 1980 monkey off their back, and they could just focus on winning titles. What do you expect them to become? Do you expect them to follow it up and do it again, or do you expect them to just that's going to be their one for another 40 years?
Well, so first off, you're making some large level assumptions that Georgia's going to get that monkey off their back. Secondly, you didn't tell me that there was some giant coaching gaffe in the Euro Cup, which means it's not equivalent to Georgia. The coach has to do something completely boneheaded in order to set up the devastating loss. So maybe there's something in soccer where, like, he didn't have the right person out there to kick the penalty kick. I don't know. All I know is that penalty kicks after 120 minutes of running around seems like an interesting way to end a contest. But so third, we all hate England, or at least we should. So, Bill Simmons used to be funny on Twitter. One of my favorite tweets is back in 2009. He tweeted, "The 4th of July is like one super slow home run trot around the bases as the English stare us down from the mound. Suck it, England." And I'm like, that's what I think of every time England goes out and loses. So in that way, they're sort of like Georgia. And the fact that the Euro Cup was during the 4th of July week does sort of make that a little bit more prescient. But I think it depends a lot. Like, there are a lot of Florida fans who enjoy making fun of Kirby Smart, and they call him Mark Richt. But I wonder whether he's more John Cooper. I wonder whether he's more that Ohio State coach, because Ohio State was loaded every year under Cooper.
90s.
They had the best talent in the Big Ten by far every year, and still somehow couldn't get past Michigan, even though Michigan, obviously Lloyd Carr was a good coach, but Michigan was not Alabama, right? They weren't like winning national titles.
A lot of 8-4s in there for Michigan. 9-3s, 8-4s in those years.
Well, and so in some respects, that was sort of Ohio State losing a game they shouldn't to their major rival.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be interesting to see whether Nolen can produce that, right? Is Nolen going to be able to produce? Maybe Florida isn't going to be the most talented team every year out of the two, but is he going to be able to at least outcoach Kirby Smart to a point where, maybe 50% of the time Smart has a hiccup against Florida, doesn't even get to the SEC championship game. And then the other 50% of the time does get to the SEC championship game. And oh, look who's waiting right there, his mentor from Alabama. I think it's a tough road for Georgia. I mean, I think this year is one where you sort of circle it and say they think they finally found their quarterback. They think that they're going to have enough experience on the defensive side of the ball to be able to at least offset some of the losses that they had. I mean, we looked at the experience. Their experience isn't that high, though it is compared to Alabama. But again, you look at Alabama. Alabama's breaking a new quarterback. Florida's breaking a new quarterback. This is really the year. And if it doesn't happen, then you are looking at a team more like John Cooper at Ohio State or more like Jim Harbaugh at Michigan, right? I mean, Harbaugh came in, had some pretty good years to start with, and then it's sort of been downhill from there. Obviously, he hasn't recruited at the same level that Kirby Smart did. But, you know, I think the way Gator Dave says it on Gators Breakdown, and it's the way I feel about it, is that recruiting is not the only thing that leads to national championships, but it's kind of a prerequisite, right? That you have to have a certain level of athlete in order to win the national title. And then to win the national title consistently over and over and over again, especially in this day and age, you need to be bringing in those top 5 classes. But top 5 classes don't guarantee national championships. Just go ask USC. I mean, Helton is a heck of a recruiter, but USC hasn't been the best team in the Pac-12 for damn near a decade at this point, right? And so it doesn't guarantee anything, and Kirby Smart is showing that. And until he gets over the hump, we're going to be able to continue to throw 1980 in their face. I don't. It's hard for me to believe, or it's hard for me to like envision a world where we don't have that to just mock Georgia fans.
I'm sorry for even bringing it up. It was a thought that occurred to me while I was watching England, which is the de facto Georgia of international soccer, almost win. I was like, man, we might have to confront this one day. But luckily we haven't had to yet.
Well, I mean, here's the deal, right? I mean, if we saw what happened when Nick Saban overtook Urban Meyer. Everybody thought Urban Meyer was building a huge behemoth in Florida, had the #1 recruiting class in 2009. Nick Saban comes in, is able to win the SEC championship game. The Florida dynasty falls apart pretty quickly, and then Saban takes over. That would be like worst case scenario, right? As Saban gets beat by Kirby Smart and decides, oh, I guess it's time to hang it up. And all of a sudden there isn't somebody sitting on the other side. All of a sudden Smart is that guy, right? He's the guy who sort of set the standard and has the national title and is already bringing in all the recruits, so that it's just sort of a self-perpetuating thing, kind of like it's been at Clemson and Ohio State and Alabama. That's sort of the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is that we get some 5-star quarterback that he brings, and maybe Vandergraaf's going to come in and run a fake punt this year in the SEC championship game. That's the hope, man.
Well, listen, folks, it's still the middle of July. We're trying to come up with some topics here. Thought the tie-in between England and Georgia was nice, but I'm really sorry for even putting out the universe that Georgia might be able to win something. So I take that back. I don't even know what I was thinking. I almost feel like I need to apologize to everybody. But anyway, Will, you got any final words before we head out?
Yeah, just really appreciate everybody supporting us. Like and subscribe down below if you like what you see here. We're enjoying putting this stuff out, and certainly have been overwhelmed by the level of support that people have given us. There's also going to be a bonus edition on Patreon for this one that we're going to put up there. So if you support us over there, you can get bonus editions of this if you like that, and then also some other stuff we throw up over there from time to time as well. So especially as the season comes along, there's going to be more topics, more things to discuss, and we'll have more bonus stuff coming on the Patreon channel as the season gets along.
Thanks for joining us tonight, and go Gators. Thank you for watching this episode of Stand Up and Holler. Be sure to subscribe to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel, join our Patreon community at Read and Reaction for bonus content each week, and check out our website at readandreaction.com. I'm Nick Knutson, joined by Will Miles, and as always, go Gators.